Hello and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched True Grit from 2010. Now, this movie has been on my list actually basically since it came out, but for a whole bunch of reasons I have never gotten around to it. And I couldn't even particularly remember why it was, or the specifics of the reasons why it was on my list, other than it being, a Western revival kind of thing, which, if you've been a long time watcher, I'm kind of curious and interested in where that genre goes. But I couldn't remember some of the details until actually after I had watched the entire film and I was doing a quick review before doing this. One was I forgot that this is actually a Coen Brothers film. And I've talked previously about how much I like the Coen Brothers. And actually, a lot of the qualities of this film are Coen Brothers-esque. Like, I could, in retrospect, identify them of like, oh yeah, that's one of their hallmarks, those sorts of things. But it's also, generally speaking, a less Coen-y film than a lot of theirs. And so it doesn't immediately stand out. One of the other things that identifies it that way is their casting, which wouldn't have necessarily put two and two together until seeing the names, and then it immediately clicks. One of the other things, the reason I haven't gotten around to this is because I've actually been mixing it up with another film that's also on my list. And I couldn't remember. I was trying to remember which one it was because somebody gave me a warning at some point about something. And I thought it was this movie. And then I realized, no, that was Bone Tomahawk, which I also have not seen yet. But I was mixing the two up, and that one is apparently got some things to be warned about. I also didn't remember that this is a remake of... or not a remake, it's a reimagining, a reinterpretation of a book that was already made into a film once. There's another movie called True Grit from 1969, I believe, that is one of John Wayne's most famous performances. And it was actually not until one of the scenes late in the film that I remembered there was a line, and I went, I recognize that. And then I had to go look it up, and I was like, oh, I've seen that scene before, and I've seen a couple of scenes from that movie, but I've never actually watched it. Mostly because if you've been a longtime viewer of this show, I don't particularly care for John Wayne and don't think he's a good actor, and a whole bunch of other reasons not to be particularly interested in it. But we'll put a pin in that because I'm actually going to come back to talk about the other one in retrospect because I did a quick skim afterwards. Anyway, with this being a Coen Brothers film, had I remembered that, I would have had certain expectations, and I don't know whether that would have changed my feelings on this, but as I was watching it, but it definitely has a few qualities that definitely make it apparent why this was something the Coen Brothers picked up. Allegedly, this is supposed to be more accurate to the book than the original film. I haven't read the book, so I don't actually know. But some of the qualities that definitely stand out about it that I think are unusual within Westerns, among other things, is it's got a definite dry kind of black comedy to it that runs throughout the entire film. It doesn't shy away from, it's definitely trying to be very serious most of the time, but it's not afraid to have moments of unseriousness or breaks in character because of the situations that the characters are not totally serious, and to have that sort of that break in an otherwise very serious sort of theme and genre in general is very welcome. I also Coen Brothers can go up and down on this, and I think they generally ride the line very well, but they do edge into sort of the dark for darkness's sake territory sometimes. They're a little bit both literally and figuratively, where they can sometimes both shoot stuff that is particularly grim in tone, as well as visually very gritty. No pun intended in this case. And I think that works to good effect here, but it is also sort of a memory of what the cinematic landscape looked like in 2010. I sort of forgotten this movie was this old, actually. And there's definitely something to be said overall for it could use a little bit more color. It could be a little less washed out, a little less gray and brown, but there's nothing new there. And I don't think that's, unique to this movie in any, in any way or for the time. As far as the rest of the cinematography, I think that there is some good subtle cinematography that I think is done very well. There are some interesting shots that are cut in and shot angles that are used for good sort of emotional setting and those sorts of things. But there are also certain elements of it that I think are disappointing in their cinematography. Sometimes it's just, oh, this is kind of a sloppy composite, and maybe they would have liked to reshoot this, but this is the footage they had, or something like that. And then there are others that, in retrospect, I realize are actually probably more or less shot-for-shot recreations of scenes from the original film as a partial homage, and sometimes as sort of a satire even. And I'm not sure that always works to the best effect. Sometimes I think the subtext there may have gotten the better of them, and their interest in saying something about the original or some such thing gets in the way of what might have made for a more interesting shot. This is the cinematography is by Roger Deakins, who has worked with the Coens a lot. So I don't, I can't say one way or another whether I think it's. I don't want to say it's good or bad. I think it's very middle of the road. I think for the industry in general, it's quite good with only a few standout shots that I don't particularly like. For the Coens in general, though, I think it's kind of unremarkable. There are a lot of just sort of very standard shots, and it's a little bit disappointing, if only because I know that both the Coens and Deakins can do better. So it's not my favorite thing there, but I think it makes it more approachable, probably. I also didn't realize this is a PG-13 rated film, which is definitely a choice on the part of the Coens. They usually are hard R all the way through, like every single one of their films. I don't know if that's actually true, but generally speaking, they're not ones to shy away from anything. So turning this into a PG-13 film is definitely a choice. And clearly it worked out for them. By all accounts, this did extremely well, much better than it was expected to. And I think for 2010, the Western genre was not in a good place. I've talked previously in some of my other videos. If you haven't watched those, go watch the other Western ones, about sort of the state of the Western genre. And especially in 2010, it would not have been a particularly appealing. Like, that's just the very beginning edge of people starting to sort of dip their toes back in high budget ways into the genre, I think. There are a few exceptions prior to that, but yeah. As far as the casting and stuff goes, this really runs the gamut. Most of the performances are very, very good, even from relatively minor characters who only have one scene or very brief performances in a few scenes, stuff like that. But interestingly, so and Jeff Bridges is cast as one of the primary characters. He's the character who was previously played by John Wayne, and he does an excellent job, I think. Generally speaking, I have very little that I could contribute to how I think his performance is done. I think it is a great contrast to the character that Wayne plays in the original. John Wayne only plays John Wayne. He's got no nuance. So even before I looked up some scenes, I knew exactly what it was going to look like. And having seen some scenes as well, I'd seen some scenes before, then I remembered his other performances in other things, and then I looked up some more scenes for some reference. John Wayne only ever plays the self-righteous. Anyway, I won't get into that. I've talked about it before. I love Jeff Bridges as a counterpoint to that. He is very much sort of anti-heroic. He's a washed up alcoholic who has very few redeeming qualities. In every scene seems to not necessarily make himself seem like a worse person, but a more nuanced bad person. And I think that is a testament both to his performance and to the dialogue that's written for him. This is not dialogue that John Wayne would have read in many cases. So I like this much, much better. I think he does an excellent job. I think the other really standout performance is by Haley Steinfeld, who is now a relatively large name. This is her first performance ever, and I believe she was actually 14 in this movie. I knew the character says that that she's 14, but I thought that, I guess partially I didn't realize how old this film was, but also she doesn't particularly look nor perform like somebody who's 14 and it's her first role. I mean, I presume she probably had acting before that, but first Hollywood role. Her performance throughout this is pretty extraordinary. There are certain little qualities that you might be able to take qualms with, whether it's certain elements of her accent or just certain line reads that are a little bit too straight on, that could have been given a hair more nuance. But that's really starting to nitpick if you're looking for issues, because in general, both her vocal acting and her physical acting is pretty extraordinary. She's asked to put herself through a lot physically in this movie, and also to read some very difficult language and perform it in, an accent that's not her own and in a type of English that is not spoken really anymore. And I think she does an extraordinary job. Definitely also a very different kind of character to her counterpart in the original casting of the film. And I think she's a perfect casting for what the Coens seem to have been looking for. So I'm going to dip into, for a second, talking about the differences between the two movies, if only because I think it's an interesting contrast. I skimmed through the original movie after, just for like 10 minutes to give myself some reference points. Those two characters have a similar but rather different dynamic. At its core, they are the same characters, but the dynamic between them is very colored by who they are as people. In the original, John Wayne is sort of a roughneck type of guy who everybody sort of shakes their finger at, etc., but he's ultimately the quintessential Western good guy. Comparatively speaking, as I mentioned, Bridges plays the character as kind of a drunken lout who's barely, he's cocky until the moment doesn't have anything to be cocky about anymore, and then he's in a slump. And he's kind of pathetic in various ways. By comparison, Haley's character, or the original casting for Maddie Ross, is a unique character in her own right for a Western from the 60s, in that she's sort of this bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, smart-witted, but maybe very out of her depth and still naive type of character. Comparatively speaking, Haley plays the character, and is directed as such by the very different kind of writing, as well. It plays a character who is kind of extraordinary, like almost to the point of everybody around her being put off by how aggressive she is, not only as a woman, but as a 14-year-old who's, doing legal negotiations and like basically browbeat. Like there's a scene where she just browbeats this this shopkeeper because he's being a piece of work and he's trying to pull one over on her, etc., etc. And that dialogue between them is like extraordinary, and it really sets the stage really well for who her character is long term in the film, rather than a hanger-on where in the original film it's all about John Wayne and she's just sort of there to go ooh and ah for the most part that I could see. Maddie is very much a character in her own right in this film, and that is apparently what the original book is like, and what the Coens were much more looking for. Was they wanted this to be centered around her as the center of the narrative as she is in the book. I think it's an extraordinary casting. It's an extraordinary performance from her, and really sets a very different kind of narrative from the Western history in general, and even from other Westerns that have come out, in recent times. The only other actor, well, I'll talk about both. There are two other actors who are high billed here, and I don't think they're as great. One is Matt Damon, who plays Ranger LaBeouf, or LaBeef as he calls it. I don't think that's Matt Damon's problem. I think that's actually the way the character pronounces it. But I can't get past looking at Matt Damon and hearing Matt Damon, and Matt Damon just not being a particularly nuanced actor. He basically, like many others, just plays Matt Damon with slight inflections. And he's fine, but it's Matt Damon, and it's a little distracting to me personally. His performance is otherwise fine, unremarkable, not very impressive, and if you wanted to lean into this sort of rivalry that Jeff Bridges and Matt Damon's characters have, he needs a stronger character to play against Bridges, and Matt Damon is just not putting up that performance. A more minor character who also has high billing is played by Josh Brolin, who is mostly unremarkable and really not that present in the film. He's only kind of briefly there. And the performance is sort of fine, but not memorable. And so it's just a matter of, if you bill someone high for their name, there's a little bit of an expectation at some level. So if you were hoping for a really good Josh Brolin performance, this is fine. It's mediocre. It's not doing anything wrong, but it's not very interesting. Let's see. Let's talk about, I've already sort of talked about the tone and the arc of the plot. The tone, I think, does that thing where it does dip into its humor from time to time. It's willing to have moments of moments of quiet, moments of levity, moments where it's not, this movie never really beats the drum of the typical Western, the typical self-righteousness, hoorah America type stuff. That's very not present. And actually that brings me to the scene that made me realize that it was a scene I recognized, which is the one near the end. It's a very iconic scene where Rooster, the Jeff Bridges' character, charges against some guys. If you know the scene, you know the one I'm talking about. And he says an iconic line right as he starts. And that really threw me off because it's so weird in the context of the rest of the film. In a John Wayne film, it makes, apparently it's from the book as well, but in a John Wayne film, it fits perfectly. It fits the tone of the American exceptionalism, hero of the Old West type thing, but it's very weird coming out of Jeff Bridges' performances, Jeff Bridges' version of Rooster. And there are a few little moments like that where it breaks the wall a little bit, and I don't know if some of the other ones are also references or not. I don't particularly intend to find out. But generally speaking, I think the tone of the thing overall is a lot more is very consistent. Well, it's not consistent. It's not consistent, but in a good way. It's willing to give you those emotional ups and downs, and it's also willing to give you. I don't want to spoil anything. It's willing to be unsatisfying, which is very important. It's an underused thing in cinema in particular and in writing in general. I think it's something you see a lot more in prose, but is kind of rare in general to see it in big Hollywood productions. And it's also something that doesn't fit at all to the typical Western. The typical Western is so hinged on those ideas of the manifest destiny, the American exceptionalism, the good guy always wins type of stuff, that there are so many scenes in here and so many plot beats that don't play out in a satisfying way, that are deliberately like moments of failure or darkness or things not going right, that if you were looking for a very traditional Western, it doesn't play to that at all. And I think that is very much a positive. Let's see, what else can I talk about? Generally speaking, like I mentioned, the cinematography is a bit muddy, but I generally think that it's still a pretty film. There's still a lot of effort that went into things like costuming, effects work, stuff like that. I think it could have a little bit more punch if it wasn't dulled down so much in post, but that's a fairly minor thing. Artistry wise, I think this is generally a very good film. And yeah, it's pretty sparing with its soundtrack as well. That was one of the other elements of that same scene that I was just talking about. There is this sudden surge of music that is very out of place for the rest of the movie and very much reminiscent of that particular, Western type of style that's not present anywhere else in the movie. Generally speaking, the movie does a very good job of having fairly subtle, a fairly subtle score, and a really good job with its audio. There's a lot of sort of long shots and things like that where you hear firearms cracking and stuff like that. And I think that's all tuned very well. It's something that could easily get wrong. So for this fairly complex cinematic styling where you have lots of these different distance shots, getting that audio right is always something that I think is worth noting as well. Let's see. Anything else I can talk about here? I think it's a pretty strong showing. I don't think it's one of the Coen brothers' best films to me. It's not. It it's complicated, right? If you put the entire Coen brothers filmography, or the ones that I've seen at least, in perspective, I think this is one of their more unremarkable films. It's also deliberately more sanitized by virtue of having that PG-13 rating. And I don't fault them for that at all. I think that's even a smart choice. A lot of their other movies do also have hallmarks of the Western genre or adaptations of ideas from the Western genre. So it's interesting to see them do an actual Western. I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to remember if they've done anything that actually I would consider a true Western. Something like No Country for Old Men might be the thing that's closest, but it's like almost an anti-Western. But on the other hand, if I'm not comparing it to other Coen Brothers films, as a Western, as a post 2000 Western or post 70s Western even, I think it's pretty extraordinary as an example of what can be done within the genre. I think in the list of Westerns made in the last 30 years, it's probably in the top 5. And I can even see influences from this or at least parallels between this and something like Django Unchained and The Hateful Eight. So I would be curious. I don't actually know if Tarantino has seen this film or likes the Coen brothers. I don't recall what his take has been with them, but I could see some of the other contenders within that modern Western list having some parallels in what makes them extraordinary. So I think in the Western list, this is pretty darn good. And for that reason, not that I wasn't already going to recommend it, but I think especially if you're looking for an example of a good Western made recently, this is a pretty darn good one. Anyway, I think that mostly covers my bases. I think it's worth checking out. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched, and I'll see you guys next time.